Said, it was time to take a crash course in high-rise fires. It seems that high-rise fires are more common than I thought. I found hundreds of them. According to a 2011 report by the National Fire Protection Association, there are an average of 110 fires each year in buildings over 13 stories tall. According to the report, between 2005 and 2009, there were 550 high-rise fires. Of course, there are many more all throughout history, but let's talk about some of the more startling ones. Sao Paulo, Brazil, the Joelma building, 1974. Sparked by an electrical fire, the residential building burned twice as long as the Twin Towers, yet it stood. The underlying structure wasn't even weakened. In fact, it's still in use today. The MGM Grand, which is now Bally's in Las Vegas, Nevada, caught fire in 1980, killing 85 people. It's had a few facelifts and ownership changes, but the structure underneath was never compromised. It's still in use today. Los Angeles, California, 1988. What was then called the First Interstate Bank building burned for 3.5 hours. No structural failure at all. In fact, an insurance company moved in, and today it's known as the Aon Center. In 2004, the Parque Central building in Caracas, Venezuela, the country's tallest building, burned for 17 hours. The facade was repaired, and it is in use today. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, One Meridian Plaza, 1991, burned for 18 hours. It stood. Beijing, China, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, burned for 6 hours in 2009. It stood. Chechnya's tallest building burned for 7 hours in April 2013. It stood. Dubai, Moscow, Zurich, and on and on. I was starting to see a trend. Fires don't melt steel or cause buildings to collapse. The World Trade Center has itself burned many times with no structural failure or weakening. Some significant dates include February 13, 1975, when the 9th to the 14th floors burned for 3 hours. No damage or weakening of the structure was recorded.
The fire began in an electrical wiring closet on the 11th floor. Some fire department officials and building officials here say that there's no chance the World Trade Center could become a type of towering inferno.
And in 1993, it survived a bomb detonated in a highly vulnerable area with no structural damage caused by the fires that resulted from the explosion. There was, of course, damage from the bomb, which had to be repaired, but through it all, the towers have always stood. Sometimes buildings do collapse because of structural failure, but it's usually a design problem or earthquake damage or a controlled demolition. Buildings don't come down because of fire, but when they do collapse, they tend to tip over and stay connected. After reviewing hundreds of fires, I could find only 3 occurrences of fire bringing down a steel-framed high-rise in all of history, and all 3 were on 9/11.
High-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire.
Collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
But there's a problem. Office and open-air jet fuel fires cannot melt steel.
A lot of things in these kind of buildings have to be fire resistant by nature. It's required by code. So there really isn't a whole lot of fuel in there to begin with.
The National Institute of Standards and Technology said that the maximum air temperatures was about 1,800 degrees or 1,000 degrees colder than what's needed to melt steel.
And it takes a blast furnace with air blowing with blowers to try to get steel to melt.
So if you have a flame at 750 degrees, you can hold that flame under a steel beam forever, and you'll never reach a high enough temperature to bend steel, let alone melt it.
This would have us to believe that these was a typical office fire, scattered office fires, if you will, that brought this building down. Since the mid-60s, I've tried to follow high-rise fires, and I'm not aware of any high-rise building that have come down as a result of fires.
And seeing black smoke come out the windows, that means that the fires were oxygen starved.
Kerosene would have burned off very quickly. What wasn't destroyed in the initial fireball would have been consumed fairly rapidly and would have only really served as an ignition for the rest of the material.
None of which would have been, in my experience as a fire protection engineer, hot enough to sufficiently soften the steel or damage the steel to result in a total collapse of the building.
Well, we're told that the planes hit the buildings and there was an explosion and a fire, and about an hour and a half later, in the case of the North Tower, the buildings collapsed due to structural weakening due to the fires. Fires in high-rises have never brought down a steel frame high-rise building at all, ever.
The bottom line is this. Steel-framed high-rises don't collapse, especially into their own footprint, because of fire. This is why builders and architects have loved steel for 100 years. A fire typically can't compromise the steel structure. Of course, 9/11 was not a typical day with typical fires. Jet fuel was involved. But the kerosene, or the jet fuel, just can't explain it. Set aside for a minute that only 2 of the buildings were subjected to kerosene. Now think of a kerosene lamp or a kerosene heater. In the history of kerosene lamps, I have never heard of one being melted because the fires were too hot. In fact, the World Trade Center fires were starved of oxygen and therefore heat. You can see it in the black smoke coming from the towers. Yet molten iron was found in the rubble of all 3 buildings. Something else had to provide the heat and energy needed to liquefy, melt, or even microscopically bend the steel in any of those 3 buildings. And unless you work for NIST, scientists agree that neither jet fuel, nor the furnishings inside those buildings could have heated the steel enough to melt it. I was starting to realize that something else must have been involved in the collapse of at least Building 7, if not all 3. Okay, maybe airplanes weakened the structure of the Twin Towers, which we'll be looking into more deeply later. For now, believe it or not, planes have hit many buildings throughout history and none fell. Of course, none were hit with planes as large as the ones on 9/11, but that still leaves Building 7. I couldn't explain it. Can you tell me that if I throw a flaming chunk of metal off of one building, I can make the building next to it collapse in on itself a few hours later? Why do demolition companies even exist if you can just light a few random fires and wait for an implosion? Maybe the steel structure in Building 7 was so badly damaged from falling debris that the entire structure was compromised. It still can't explain the symmetrical collapse, but I looked anyway. Other buildings that have suffered severe structural damage by natural disaster or bombs didn't disintegrate into rubble piles. They stayed together in some way. Even the buildings in the Trade Center complex that suffered worse damage than Building 7 didn't collapse in on themselves. This uneasy feeling was growing, but there was much more to understand about Building 7's collapse, especially before I started jumping to conclusions in my own head. I needed to hear from some experts.